The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the polished mahogany table as Marcus Henderson stood, champagne flute raised high, his practiced smile gleaming under the warm lighting of the Riverside Grille's exclusive Cedar Room. 50 guests, colleagues, clients, family members, all turned expectantly toward my husband as he prepared to deliver what everyone assumed would be a heartfelt tribute to our 15 years of marriage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus began, his voice carrying that familiar commanding tone that had charmed boardrooms and sealed million-dollar deals. Tonight we celebrate not just 15 years of marriage, but 15 years of strategic partnership. A few appreciative murmurs rippled through the crowd. When I met Claire, I knew I'd found something rare, a woman willing to sacrifice her own ambitions for the greater good. While other wives might have complained about the long hours, the missed dinners, the postponed vacations, Claire understood that building an empire requires dedication from both partners. I maintained my practiced smile, the same expression I'd perfected over countless dinner parties and business functions. But something cold was settling in my stomach as Marcus continued, his words taking an increasingly sharp edge. Some might call her contribution, well, let's be honest, deadweight in today's competitive market. Nervous laughter scattered through the room like broken glass, but I've learned that every successful man needs someone willing to handle the small details, the domestic trivialities that would otherwise distract from real business. Claire has mastered the art of staying in her lane. The room fell into uncomfortable silence. Even Marcus's most sycophantic business partners shifted awkwardly in their seats. But my husband, emboldened by champagne and his own perceived cleverness, pressed forward with his character assassination disguised as a toast. So here's to my beautiful wife, he concluded, raising his glass higher, who learned early that supporting a visionary means stepping back from her own modest academic pursuits. 15 years of deadweight, and somehow I've managed to carry us both to success. The scattered applause that followed was weak, embarrassed, obligatory. I could see my sister Nina's face flushed with anger at the far end of the table, while Marcus's own mother looked away in obvious mortification. But Marcus seemed oblivious to the discomfort he'd created, settling back into his chair with the satisfied expression of a man who believed he'd delivered a masterpiece. That was the moment I reached into my purse and withdrew the manila envelope I'd been carrying for 3 months. "Thank you for that illuminating toast, darling," I said, my voice cutting through the awkward silence as I stood. "Since we're being so honest about contributions tonight, I thought this might be the perfect time to share something I've been working on." I slid the envelope across the table toward Marcus, who glanced at it with amused curiosity. "Anniversary gift?" he asked, his tones still dripping with condescension. "How thoughtful. Should I open it now or save it for later?" "Oh, I think now would be perfect," I replied, "especially since it concerns several people in this room." Marcus's confidence faltered slightly as he opened the envelope and pulled out the first document, a detailed financial analysis showing exactly where the startup capital for Henderson and Associates had originated. His face began to drain of color as he recognized his own signature on loan documents, investment agreements, and partnership contracts that told a very different story than the one he'd been spinning for 15 years. "What is this?" he asked, his voice losing its commanding edge. "That's the paper trail showing that every major breakthrough in your consulting firm's development came from ideas I researched, proposals I wrote, and connections I facilitated," I answered calmly. "The Morrison account that launched your reputation, that came from my graduate advisor's recommendation. The Phillips merger strategy that made you famous, based on my thesis research on corporate restructuring that I shared with you over dinner. The Wellington contract that bought us this house. I spent 6 months developing that presentation while you took credit in the boardroom." Marcus's business partner Kevin Torres leaned forward, trying to get a glimpse of the documents. "Marcus, what is she talking about?" "It's all documented," I continued, removing additional papers from the envelope. 15 years of intellectual property theft, partnership fraud, and systematic credit manipulation. See, while you were telling everyone how you carried deadweight, I was keeping meticulous records of exactly who was carrying whom. The foundation of my transformation began not with grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but with something as simple as a doctoral dissertation that never got finished. When Marcus and I met during his second year of law school, I was deep into my PhD program in organizational psychology at Pacific Northwest University, researching the intersection of leadership theory and corporate culture. My advisor, Elizabeth Hartwell, had described my work as groundbreaking, a comprehensive analysis of how small consulting firms could compete with major corporations through innovative partnership strategy. Marcus had been struggling academically, overwhelmed by the rigorous demands of his program while working part-time to cover expenses. I remember the evening he first asked for help with a corporate law assignment, his usual confidence replaced by genuine vulnerability. "I'm drowning, Claire," he'd admitted over coffee in the university library. "Everyone else seems to understand these concepts intuitively, but I feel like I'm speaking a foreign language." That night, I spent 4 hours explaining complex legal frameworks, breaking down case studies, and helping him develop the analytical thinking that law school demanded. His grades improved dramatically. Within weeks, he was asking for help with other assignments, and I found myself essentially tutoring him through his most challenging courses. What started as occasional assistance evolved into a systematic support system where I researched his papers, outlined his arguments, and even edited his final submissions. The pattern established itself gradually, almost imperceptibly. Marcus would present problems, academic, professional, social, and I would provide solutions. When he worried about securing a summer internship, I leveraged my professor's connections to arrange interviews. When he struggled with networking events, I coached him on conversation strategies and helped him prepare talking points that would impress potential employers. When he needed to write his senior thesis, I spent countless hours in the library gathering research while he focused on his part-time job. "You're so much better at this academic stuff," he would say, dismissing his own intellectual capabilities while praising mine. "I'm more of a people person, a big-picture thinker. You handle the details and I'll handle the execution." It seemed like a reasonable division of labor at the time, a partnership that played to our respective strengths. The first major sacrifice came during my 4th year of graduate school. Marcus had been accepted to 3 different law schools, but his top choice required him to start immediately, which would mean relocating across the country, just as I was entering the most critical phase of my dissertation research. Dr. Hartwell had arranged for me to present my preliminary findings at a major academic conference, an opportunity that could have launched my career in organizational consulting. "This is my shot, Claire," Marcus had said, his eyes bright with ambition. "Harvard doesn't offer deferrals, and this opportunity won't come again. We both know your research will still be here when we get back. Academic careers are flexible like that." I canceled my conference presentation, withdrew from my program, and followed Marcus to Cambridge. The plan was for me to finish my dissertation remotely while he completed law school, after which we would figure out the next steps together. But remote doctoral work proved more challenging than anticipated, especially while supporting Marcus through his intensified academic demand. My research stagnated, then stalled, then quietly died, as I became increasingly absorbed in Marcus's educational journey. The morning Marcus graduated from law school summa cum laude, he thanked me in his speech to family and friends. None of this would have been possible without my incredible partner Claire, who sacrificed her own academic pursuits to help me achieve this dream. The applause was warm and appreciative, and I felt a genuine sense of accomplishment. We had done this together, and Marcus's success would benefit us both as we moved forward into the next chapter of our lives. That next chapter began with Marcus's decision to start his own consulting firm, rather than join an established practice. "Why should I make money for someone else when I can build something that belongs to us?" he reasoned. It was an ambitious plan that required significant startup capital, extensive research into market opportunities, and the development of a comprehensive business strategy that would differentiate Henderson and Associates from the hundreds of other small consulting firms competing for clients. Marcus handled the networking and client-facing activities, while I took responsibility for what he termed the boring but essential background work. I researched potential markets, analyzed competitor strategies, developed service offerings, and created the foundational documents that would guide the company's growth. My abandoned dissertation research proved invaluable. The theories I'd been developing about small firm competitive advantages became the theoretical framework for our business model. The Morrison account, which would later become Marcus's signature success story, originated from a conversation I had with Dr. Hartwell during a chance encounter at a Portland coffee shop. She mentioned that her brother-in-law was seeking consulting help for his struggling manufacturing company, and I immediately recognized the opportunity. After researching Morrison Industries' specific challenges, I developed a comprehensive turnaround strategy based on my graduate research and presented it to Marcus, who then pitched it to the client as his own innovative approach. The strategy worked brilliantly. Morrison Industries' productivity increased by 40% within 6 months, their employee satisfaction scores reached record highs, and their profit margins improved dramatically. Marcus was featured in 3 business journals as an emerging talent in organizational consulting, with reporters praising his intuitive understanding of corporate culture dynamics and his innovative approach to small business transformation. I watched from the audience as Marcus accepted an award for excellence in small business consulting, listening as he described his breakthrough methodology for helping companies optimize their organizational structure. The methodology was essentially my doctoral research, repackaged and presented with Marcus's charismatic delivery style. When reporters asked about his inspiration for the approach, he spoke passionately about his natural instincts for reading corporate environments, without mentioning the 18 months of academic research that had generated those insights. The Phillips merger represented our next major success, and again, the intellectual foundation came from my work. Marcus had been approached by 2 competing firms who were considering a partnership, but couldn't agree on integration strategy. The challenge was complex. Both companies had strong cultures and established practices, and previous merger attempts had failed due to employee resistance and operational conflict. I spent 3 months researching organizational merger theory, studying case histories of successful and failed corporate integrations, and developing a framework for cultural compatibility assessment. The resulting strategy addressed not just the financial and operational aspects of the merger, but the psychological and social factors that typically determined whether combined companies thrived or collapsed. Marcus presented my research as his proprietary cultural integration protocol, a systematic approach to merger planning that prioritized employee engagement and cultural synthesis. The Phillips merger became a textbook example of how thoughtful planning could create synergies that exceeded the sum of individual company capability. Harvard Business Review featured the case study as an example of innovative consulting methodologies, and Marcus was invited to speak at conferences about his groundbreaking approach to merger planning. By our 10th anniversary, Henderson and Associates had grown from a one-person startup to a respected consulting firm with 15 employees and clients across the Pacific Northwest. Marcus had been profiled in Forbes as one of the region's most promising young entrepreneurs, and his speaking fees commanded 5-figure rates for corporate conferences and business schools. Throughout this period, my role had gradually evolved from active partner to supportive spouse. As the company grew and demanded more of Marcus's attention, I transitioned from developing strategies to managing the domestic responsibilities that allowed him to focus entirely on business growth. I coordinated his travel schedule, managed our social calendar, maintained relationships with clients' spouses, and ensured that our home remained a peaceful sanctuary, where Marcus could decompress from the pressures of running a successful company. The shift was so gradual that I barely noticed how completely I had disappeared from the professional narrative. Magazine articles about Marcus's success mentioned me only in passing, usually in the context of strong family support or work-life balance. Business associates knew me as Marcus's charming wife, the woman who hosted elegant dinner parties and remembered personal details about clients' families. My educational background became a curiosity, something that made me an interesting conversationalist at social events rather than a professional credential worthy of respect. Marcus began introducing me as my wife Claire, who keeps me grounded and organized. The language was affectionate but diminishing, positioning me as a stabilizing influence rather than an intellectual contributor. When clients asked about my work, Marcus would smile indulgently and say, "Claire is taking a break from academia to focus on family life. She's much too smart for the consulting business anyway," probably sees right through all our corporate nonsense. The comments were meant as compliments, but they carried an unmistakable subtext. I was smart but not business smart. I was educated but not practically oriented. I was valuable but not professionally relevant. Over time, this narrative became so established that I began to internalize it myself, questioning whether my academic background had any real-world application beyond helping Marcus succeed. The turning point came during a client dinner 18 months ago, when Marcus was pitching his services to the Wellington Group, a prestigious investment firm considering a major organizational restructuring. The potential contract was worth more than everything else Henderson and Associates had earned in its previous 3 years combined, and Marcus had been preparing for the presentation for weeks. During the dinner conversation, Wellington's CEO mentioned a recent Harvard Business Review article about organizational agility in uncertain markets. Fascinating piece about adaptive leadership structures, he said. The author argued that traditional hierarchical models are becoming obsolete in rapidly changing industries. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on implementing that kind of flexibility in our organization. Marcus nodded enthusiastically, but I could see the uncertainty in his eye. He hadn't read the article, and adaptive leadership theory wasn't part of his standard consulting toolkit. Absolutely crucial considerations, he replied smoothly. The theoretical frameworks around organizational agility have evolved significantly in recent years. Perhaps I could follow up with a detailed analysis of how those principles might apply to your specific situation. Later that evening, Marcus asked me to research the Harvard Business Review article and help him develop a response strategy. What I discovered was that the article built heavily on research I had conducted during my graduate studies, research that had never been published because I'd left the program before completing my dissertation. The author had independently reached many of the same conclusions I had developed years earlier, but lacked the comprehensive framework I had created for implementing adaptive structures in mid-sized organizations. I spent the next 2 weeks developing a presentation that went far beyond anything Marcus had previously delivered. The strategy I created specifically addressed Wellington's industry challenges, incorporated cutting-edge organizational theory, and provided a detailed implementation timeline with measurable outcomes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was sophisticated, innovative, and directly applicable to their specific needs. Marcus delivered the presentation flawlessly, using my research to demonstrate insights that impressed even Wellington's most skeptical board members. The contract was approved unanimously, with the CEO praising Marcus's exceptional depth of understanding about organizational psychology and his rare ability to translate academic theory into practical business solutions. That night, as we celebrated the Wellington contract over champagne in our West Hills home, Marcus toasted the brilliant consulting strategies that are going to revolutionize our business. He spoke passionately about his vision for expanding Henderson and Associates into a major regional firm, describing the innovative approaches that would set them apart from their competition. As I listened to Marcus outline his ambitious plans using the intellectual framework I had developed, I realized that somewhere over the past 15 years, I had become invisible in my own life. My ideas had become his innovations, my research had become his expertise, and my contributions had been so thoroughly absorbed into his professional identity that even he seemed to have forgotten their origin. The Wellington success led to 3 more major contracts within 6 months, each one building on strategies and frameworks I developed but Marcus presented. Henderson and Associates hired additional consultants, opened a second office, and began attracting national attention for their innovative approach to organizational development. Marcus's confidence grew along with his success, and his attitude toward my contributions began to shift in subtle but unmistakable ways. Comments that had once been appreciative became patronizing. "Thanks for handling the research, honey. You know how much I value your academic perspective," became "I can always count on you to dig up the scholarly background material while I focus on the real business implications." When I tried to discuss the theoretical foundations of his consulting approaches, Marcus would smile indulgently and redirect the conversation. "You're thinking like a professor again, Claire. Clients don't want academic theory, they want practical solutions that show immediate results." The implication was clear. My contributions were useful but ultimately secondary to his practical business acumen. The final catalyst came 6 months ago during a dinner party we hosted for Marcus's business partners and their spouses. Kevin Torres mentioned a challenging client situation involving a merger between two technology companies with dramatically different organizational cultures. It's exactly the kind of complex integration challenge that separates good consultants from great ones, he said. Marcus, didn't you develop some kind of proprietary methodology for cultural compatibility assessment? Marcus launched into an enthusiastic explanation of his cultural integration protocol, describing the framework as if he had discovered it through years of consulting experience and business intuition. He spoke about the psychological factors that influenced merger success, the importance of employee engagement during organizational transitions, and the systematic approach needed to assess cultural compatibility between companies. I listened in silence as Marcus presented my doctoral research as his professional innovation, watching our guests nod appreciatively at his insights. When Kevin asked how he had developed such sophisticated understanding of organizational psychology, Marcus smiled modestly. Experience is the best teacher, he said. You learn to read corporate cultures by working with them directly, understanding what motivates different types of organizations. Claire must be proud of all your success, said Patricia Daniels, Kevin's wife. It must be exciting to watch your husband build such an impressive company. Oh, Claire keeps me grounded, Marcus replied with affectionate condescension. She reminds me that there's life beyond business deals and profit margin. Someone has to maintain perspective while I'm out there changing the corporate world. The conversation moved on to other topics, but something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of our relationship. I wasn't Marcus's partner in building Henderson and Associates. I was his research assistant, his domestic manager, his supporting cast member in a story where he was the sole protagonist. 15 years of intellectual contribution had been reduced, keeping him grounded, as if my primary value lay in preventing him from becoming too successful rather than helping him achieve success in the first place. That night, after our guests had left and Marcus had gone to bed, I sat in my home office, surrounded by boxes of research files, academic journals and half-finished papers from my abandoned dissertation. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to fully acknowledge what I had given up and what I had received in return. I had sacrificed a promising academic career to support Marcus's ambition. I had provided the intellectual foundation for his consulting innovations, while accepting credit only for domestic support. I had transformed my expertise into his professional reputation while gradually disappearing from the professional narrative entirely. But I had also been documenting everything along the way. What began as idle curiosity during those early years of marriage had evolved into something far more systematic. I started keeping records not out of any master plan for revenge, but simply because I couldn't bear the thought of my contributions disappearing entirely into the void of Marcus's selective memory. Every research project I completed, every strategy I developed, every client connection I facilitated, I documented it all with the methodical precision that my academic training had instilled. Initially, my record-keeping was informal and scattered. I would save email drafts of research summaries I'd written for Marcus, keep copies of articles I'd highlighted and annotated for his use, and maintain folders of the strategic frameworks I'd developed for various client challenges. It seemed like basic professional organization, the kind of systematic approach that any researcher would naturally employ when working on complex projects. The documentation process became more deliberate after the Morrison account success, when I watched Marcus accept public recognition for work that had originated entirely from my graduate research. Something about seeing my theoretical frameworks presented as his innovative insights triggered a protective instinct I hadn't realized I possessed. I began creating more comprehensive records, not just of the ideas themselves, but of their development process. Initial brainstorming sessions, research methodologies, draft versions, and final implementations. My filing system grew increasingly sophisticated over the years. I maintained both physical and digital archives, with cross-referenced categories for different types of contributions. Client strategies were filed separately from research projects, which were distinct from business development initiatives and networking contributions. Each folder contained detailed timelines showing how ideas had evolved from initial concepts through final presentations, along with documentation of my specific role in their development. The most revealing records emerged from Marcus's habit of discussing business matters during our private time together. He would arrive home from client meetings energized and talkative, eager to share the challenges he was facing and brainstorm potential solutions. These conversations typically occurred during dinner or while we relaxed in the evenings, creating an informal atmosphere where Marcus felt comfortable thinking out loud about complex problems. During these sessions, I would listen carefully to his descriptions of client challenges, ask clarifying questions to better understand the underlying issues, and offer preliminary thoughts about possible approaches. Marcus valued these discussions because they allowed him to process information in a low-pressure environment, testing ideas with someone he trusted before committing to specific strategy. What Marcus didn't realize was that I had begun recording these conversations, initially as a way to remember the various challenges he was working on so I could provide more targeted research assistance. My phone, positioned casually nearby during our evening talks, captured hours of detailed discussions about client needs, competitive analyses, and strategic planning sessions. The recordings revealed patterns that became impossible to ignore as they accumulated over months and years. Time after time, the conversations would follow a similar trajectory. Marcus would present a client challenge, I would suggest theoretical frameworks or research approaches that might be relevant, and we would collaborate on developing comprehensive solutions. Days or weeks later, Marcus would present these solutions to clients as his own innovative strategies, with my contributions either minimized or completely omitted from his professional narrative. The Heartfelt Industries case provided one of the most clear-cut examples of this pattern. Marcus had described their situation during a Saturday morning breakfast conversation, explaining how the family-owned manufacturing company was struggling with succession planning as the founder prepared to retire. The challenge was complex because it involved not just business operations, but family dynamics, employee loyalty, and cultural preservation during leadership transition. I immediately recognized parallels to organizational transition theory I had studied extensively during my graduate work. Over the following week, I researched similar cases, analyzed successful succession models, and developed a comprehensive framework for managing family business transitions that balanced operational efficiency with cultural continuity. The strategy addressed legal structures, communication protocols, employee engagement initiatives, and timeline management for gradual leadership transfer. When Marcus presented this framework to Heartfelt Industries 3 weeks later, he described it as his proprietary approach to succession planning, developed through years of consulting experience with family-owned business. The strategy was implemented successfully, resulting in a smooth leadership transition that preserved the company's culture while improving operational efficiency. Marcus was subsequently invited to write an article about family business succession for a trade publication, cementing his reputation as an expert in organizational transition management. My recordings of our breakfast conversation provided undeniable evidence of how the Heartfelt strategy had actually developed. Marcus's initial description of the challenge was followed by my detailed explanation of succession planning theory, including specific academic sources and case studies that informed my recommendation. The final strategy Marcus presented to the client was essentially a refined version of the framework we had developed together during that weekend conversation. Similar patterns emerged across dozens of client cases over the year. The Brennan Group's employee retention crisis was solved using motivational theory I had researched extensively during my graduate studies. Pacific Coast Manufacturing's productivity challenges were addressed through lean management principles I had adapted from Japanese organizational models. Northwest Financial's cultural integration problems were resolved using change management frameworks I had developed specifically for their industry context. Each case followed the same basic process. Marcus would present a client challenge. I would provide theoretical foundation and research support. We would collaborate on developing solutions, and Marcus would present the final strategies as his own innovative consulting methodology. My contributions were consistently reframed as general support rather than specific intellectual property, allowing Marcus to maintain ownership of the ideas while acknowledging my role only in vague, non-specific terms. The turning point in my documentation process came during the Wellington Group presentation development. When I realized that my research was not just supporting Marcus's consulting work, it was essentially creating it. The adaptive leadership framework that secured the Wellington contract represented some of the most sophisticated organizational theory I had ever developed, building on years of academic research and practical application across multiple client contexts. After watching Marcus deliver that presentation and receive credit for insights that had originated entirely from my work, I made a conscious decision to transform my documentation from passive record-keeping into active evidence gathering. If Marcus was going to continue presenting my intellectual property as his own innovations, I needed comprehensive proof of my contributions that could withstand scrutiny from legal professionals, business associates, and academic institutions. My enhanced documentation system included several layers of evidence for each project. First, I maintained detailed research logs showing how I had developed theoretical frameworks and identified relevant academic sources. These logs included timestamps, version histories, and records of my specific methodology for analyzing client challenges and developing solutions. Second, I began creating what I called development portfolios for each major strategy or framework. These portfolios contained initial brainstorming notes in my handwriting, draft versions of presentations with my annotations and revisions, email communications where I provided research summaries to Marcus, and final versions of strategies with tracked changes showing my specific contributions to their development. Third, I expanded my recording activities beyond casual evening conversations to include more formal business discussions. When Marcus brought clients to our home for dinner meeting, I would discreetly record conversations where strategic decisions were made, often capturing moments where Marcus would explicitly acknowledge my contributions in private while planning to present them differently in professional context. The most valuable recordings captured Marcus's own admissions about the source of his consulting methodologies. During a dinner party conversation with his business partner Kevin Torres, Marcus had described how he developed his intuitive understanding of organizational psychology. The secret is having access to someone who really understands the academic foundations, he said, clearly referring to me while avoiding explicit acknowledgement. Most consultants just wing it with common sense, but having theoretical backup makes all the difference in developing sophisticated strategies. Kevin had asked whether Marcus planned to pursue formal education in organizational psychology to deepen his expertise. "Why would I need to do that?" Marcus replied with a laugh. "I've got my own personal professor right here at home. Claire handles all the heavy lifting on research and theory, and I focus on client relationships and business development. It's the perfect division of labor." These conversations provided crucial evidence that Marcus was fully aware of my intellectual contributions and deliberately chose to present them as his own professional capabilities, rather than acknowledge our collaborative relationship. They also demonstrated that he viewed my role as essentially providing academic support for his consulting practice, rather than recognizing me as an equal partner in developing innovative business strategies. The documentation process intensified after I reconnected with Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell during a chance encounter at Powell's Books downtown. I hadn't spoken with my former dissertation advisor in over a decade, and seeing her again triggered a complex mixture of nostalgia and regret about the academic career I had abandoned to support Marcus's ambitions. Dr. Hartwell was gracious about my decision to leave the program, acknowledging that life circumstances sometimes required difficult choices about professional priority. But when she asked about my current work, I found myself struggling to explain my role in Marcus's consulting business in terms that acknowledged my intellectual contributions, without seeming to complain about lack of recognition. "I've been doing organizational research and strategy development," I said carefully, primarily focused on small business consulting applications. It was technically accurate while avoiding the complicated dynamics of credit and attribution that had become central to my professional identity. Dr. Hartwell's eyes lit up with interest. "That's wonderful, Claire. I always thought your dissertation research had tremendous practical applications. Are you planning to publish any of your consulting work? The academic community would be very interested in seeing how organizational theory translates into real-world business solutions. The question caught me off guard because I had never considered the possibility of independent publication. My work had always been channeled through Marcus's consulting practice, presented under his professional identity rather than my own. The idea that my research might have value as standalone academic or professional content was both exciting and intimidating. I've been focused more on application than publication, I replied, which was true but incomplete. The consulting environment is quite different from academic research in terms of how knowledge gets shared and developed. Our conversation continued for another hour, during which Hartwell described recent developments in organizational psychology research and mentioned several opportunities for practitioners to contribute to academic discourse through case studies and applied research publication. She suggested that I consider presenting some of my consulting work at the annual Conference on Applied Organizational Psychology, which regularly featured sessions on bridging the gap between academic theory and business practice. Walking home from that encounter, I found myself imagining what it would feel like to present my own work under my own name, to receive direct recognition for the research and strategies I had been developing over the past 15 years. The fantasy was intoxicating but also painful, highlighting the vast gap between my actual intellectual contributions and my public professional identity. That evening, I began reviewing my documentation archives with fresh eyes, evaluating my research not as support material for Marcus's consulting practice, but as a substantial body of independent work that might have value in its own right. What I discovered was a comprehensive collection of applied organizational theory that addressed some of the most challenging aspects of small business development and corporate culture management. The strategies I had developed for Henderson and Associates clients represented innovative applications of academic research to practical business problems. My frameworks for cultural integration, succession planning, employee engagement, and organizational change management were sophisticated, well-researched, and demonstrably effective across multiple industry contexts. More importantly, my documentation provided clear evidence of the development process for each framework, showing how I had translated abstract theoretical concepts into actionable business strategy. The records demonstrated not just the final products of my research, but the intellectual journey that had led to their creation, including the academic sources that informed my approach and the analytical methods I had used to adapt theory for practical application. For the first time since leaving my doctoral program, I began to see my work as potentially valuable independent of Marcus's consulting practice. The research I had conducted, the strategies I had developed, and the frameworks I had created represented a significant intellectual achievement that deserved recognition on its own merits, rather than as background support for someone else's professional success. This realization fundamentally changed my approach to documentation. Instead of simply recording evidence of my contributions to Marcus's business, I began organizing my research as a coherent body of work that could stand alone as professional expertise in applied organizational psychology. I created comprehensive portfolios for each major area of my research, complete with theoretical foundations, methodology descriptions, case study applications, and outcome assessments. The portfolios revealed the scope and sophistication of my work in ways that even I hadn't fully appreciated. Over 15 years, I had essentially conducted an extensive research program in applied organizational psychology, developing innovative approaches to some of the most challenging aspects of business consulting while building a comprehensive database of successful implementations across diverse industry contexts. My work on organizational culture assessment alone represented a substantial contribution to the field, with detailed protocols for evaluating corporate values, communication patterns, leadership structures, and employee engagement level. The cultural integration frameworks I had developed for merger and acquisition context,
provided systematic approaches to preserving valuable cultural elements while facilitating necessary organizational changes. Similarly, my research on family business succession planning had generated comprehensive strategies for managing the complex dynamics involved in transitioning leadership across generations, while maintaining operational efficiency and employee loyalty. The frameworks addressed not just the technical aspects of succession planning, but the psychological and social factors that often determined whether transitions succeeded or failed. The employee engagement initiatives I had designed for various clients represented another area of substantial innovation, with evidence-based approaches to improving workplace satisfaction, productivity, and retention rate. These strategies combined motivational theory with practical implementation protocols, creating sustainable programs that addressed both individual employee needs and organizational performance requirements. As I organized this material into professional portfolios, I began to understand that Marcus had built his consulting reputation on the foundation of my research, without acknowledging the extent to which his success depended on my intellectual contribution.
The innovative methodologies that distinguished Henderson and Associates from their competitors were essentially applications of my academic expertise, refined through years of practical implementation, but originated from my theoretical knowledge and research capabilities. This recognition was both empowering and deeply unsettling. On one hand, it validated my sense that I had been making significant intellectual contributions that deserved acknowledgement and respect. On the other hand, it highlighted the extent to which I had allowed my professional identity to be subsumed into Marcus's career advancement, accepting a supporting role in my own intellectual work. The situation became even more complex when I realized that my documentation provided not just evidence of intellectual contribution, but potential proof of professional misconduct on Marcus's part. Academic and professional ethics required clear attribution of intellectual property, especially when research and ideas were being presented for commercial gain or professional advancement. Marcus's pattern of presenting my work as his own innovations potentially violated multiple professional standards, from basic academic integrity requirements to business ethics guidelines for consulting practices. The scope and systematic nature of this pattern, documented over 15 years of collaboration, suggested deliberate appropriation of intellectual property, rather than inadvertent failure to provide proper attribution. More troubling was the realization that Marcus's public presentations and published articles had consistently misrepresented the source of his consulting methodologies, potentially misleading clients about the foundation of his expertise. When he described his intuitive understanding of organizational psychology or his natural instincts for reading corporate cultures, he was essentially claiming personal knowledge and capabilities that actually derived from my academic training and research. The professional implications of this pattern were serious enough that I began researching the relevant ethical guidelines and legal standards for intellectual property attribution in consulting contexts. What I discovered was that the business world had clear expectations about crediting collaborators and acknowledging the source of methodologies, especially when those methodologies were being presented as proprietary innovations that justified premium consulting fees. The academic implications were even more serious. Marcus had published several articles in business journals and trade publications describing his consulting approaches, and had been invited to speak at professional conferences about his innovative methodology. These presentations and publications had enhanced his professional reputation and generated additional business opportunities, all based on work that had originated from my research and intellectual contribution. From an academic perspective, this pattern constituted systematic plagiarism on a scale that could have serious professional consequences if properly documented and reported to relevant authorities. The evidence I had gathered showed not just occasional failure to provide proper attribution, but a sustained pattern of intellectual property appropriation that had been central to Marcus's professional development and business success. As I grappled with these realizations, I found myself confronting fundamental questions about my own complicity in the situation. I had provided my research and ideas willingly, often enthusiastically, without explicitly demanding recognition or attribution. I had accepted Marcus's presentation of our collaborative work as his individual achievement, initially because I believed that his success would benefit us both as a married couple. But over time, the dynamic had shifted in ways that left me increasingly invisible in my own intellectual work. What had begun as willing collaboration had evolved into systematic appropriation, with Marcus claiming exclusive credit for innovations that depended entirely on my academic expertise and research capability. The documentation I had gathered over 15 years provided comprehensive evidence of this pattern, but it also forced me to confront the extent to which I had enabled it through my own choices and priorities. I had subordinated my professional identity to Marcus's career advancement, accepting a supporting role that had gradually erased my intellectual contributions from the public narrative of Henderson and Associates' success. Now sitting in my home office, surrounded by boxes of evidence, documenting 15 years of intellectual contribution and professional invisibility, I had to decide what to do with the knowledge I had gained about my own situation. The anniversary dinner was approaching, and Marcus was planning what he clearly intended as a celebration of his individual achievements, rather than our collaborative partnership. But I had other plans for that evening, plans that would finally give me the opportunity to reclaim recognition for my own intellectual work and force an honest reckoning with the true foundation of Henderson and Associates consulting success. The documentation I had gathered would serve as evidence, but more importantly, it would serve as validation of my own professional capabilities and intellectual achievements. For 15 years, I had been Marcus's invisible partner in building a successful consulting practice. After tomorrow night's anniversary dinner, that invisibility would finally come to an end. The systematic gathering of evidence required more than just documentation. It demanded strategic planning that would ensure my revelations carried maximum impact while protecting me from potential retaliation. 3 months before our anniversary dinner, I began developing what I privately called my liberation strategy, a comprehensive plan that would expose Marcus's intellectual theft while simultaneously establishing my credibility as an independent professional. My first priority was securing legal guidance from someone who understood both intellectual property law and the complex dynamics of business partnership. Through careful research, I identified Victoria Reed, a Portland attorney who specialized in professional ethics violations and had successfully represented several clients in cases involving academic plagiarism and business fraud. Her reputation for discretion and thoroughness made her the ideal advisor for my situation. Arranging a consultation with Victoria required delicate maneuvering to avoid arousing Marcus's suspicion. I scheduled the meeting during one of his frequent business trips, ostensibly to discuss estate planning and financial security topics that Marcus considered tedious but necessary household management tasks. He was pleased that I was taking initiative on domestic responsibilities that he preferred to delegate, never suspecting that my meeting involved strategies for professional independence rather than family financial planning. Victoria's office occupied the top floor of a sleek downtown building, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the Willamette River and the Cascade Mountains beyond. The setting projected exactly the kind of professional competence and serious expertise that I needed for what would likely become a complex legal situation. When I explained my circumstances to Victoria, her initial reaction was carefully neutral professional interest. But as I presented the documentation I had gathered over 15 years, recordings, email communications, research portfolios, and evidence of systematic intellectual property appropriation, her expression shifted to something approaching amazement. "Miss Henderson," she said after reviewing several folders of evidence, "what you've documented here represents one of the most comprehensive cases of intellectual property theft I've encountered in professional practice. The scope and systematic nature of this appropriation goes far beyond typical attribution disputes or collaboration disagreement." Victoria explained that my situation involved multiple layers of potential legal violations, from basic contract fraud to violations of professional ethics standards that governed consulting practice. The fact that Marcus had built his business reputation and financial success on systematically appropriated intellectual property created liability issues that extended beyond our personal relationship into the realm of business fraud. "The challenge," Victoria continued, "is that intellectual property disputes between spouses involve complex questions about collaborative work, joint contributions, and the expectations that exist within marriage partnership. Courts generally assume that married couples share intellectual and financial resources, which can complicate claims about individual ownership of ideas and research. However, she noted that my case was strengthened by several unique factors. First, the systematic nature of the appropriation, documented over 15 years, demonstrated a clear pattern rather than occasional attribution over. Second, Marcus's public presentations and published articles had explicitly claimed individual credit for methodologies that my documentation proved were collaborative or entirely my own work. Third, the commercial value of the appropriated intellectual property evidenced by Henderson and Associates' financial success and Marcus's professional reputation established concrete damages that extended beyond personal recognition. Most importantly, Victoria explained that my academic credentials and the sophisticated nature of my research created a strong foundation for establishing independent intellectual property rights. Unlike situations where spouses provided general support or assistance, my contributions involved specialized expertise that had clear professional value independent of our marriage relationship. Your documentation proves that you've essentially been conducting postdoctoral research in applied organizational psychology for 15 years. Victoria observed, the frameworks you've developed and the successful implementations you've achieved represent substantial intellectual property that belongs to you regardless of how your husband has chosen to present it commercially. Victoria recommended a multi-pronged approach that would address both the immediate issue of public recognition and the broader questions about intellectual property ownership and professional ethics violation. The strategy she outlined was more comprehensive than anything I had initially envisioned, involving not just personal confrontation, but potential professional consequences that could fundamentally alter Marcus's career trajectory. The first component involved formal documentation of my intellectual property claims through proper legal channels, including registration of my research methodologies as proprietary frameworks and establishment of clear ownership rights that would be legally enforceable regardless of Marcus's cooperation. This process would create an official record of my contributions that could not be disputed or minimized through selective interpretation of our collaborative history. The second component focused on professional accountability through relevant ethics boards and industry organizations. Victoria explained that business consultants were subject to professional standards that required honest representation of their qualifications and methodology. Marcus's pattern of misrepresenting the source of his expertise potentially violated these standards in ways that could result in professional censure or loss of certification. The third component involved potential civil litigation to recover financial damages related to the commercial exploitation of my intellectual property. Victoria's preliminary analysis suggested that Henderson and Associates' success was built largely on strategies and frameworks that I had developed, meaning that Marcus had essentially built a profitable business using my intellectual property without providing appropriate compensation or recognition. The goal, Victoria explained, is not necessarily to pursue all of these options simultaneously, but to ensure that you have comprehensive legal protection and multiple avenues for achieving recognition and appropriate compensation for your intellectual contribution. The strategy sessions with Victoria continued over several weeks, during which we refined the approach and developed detailed timelines for implementation. She helped me organize my evidence into professionally formatted presentations that would be compelling to ethics boards, industry reviewers, and potential civil court proceedings. Working with Victoria also forced me to confront the full scope of what I was contemplating. Exposing Marcus's intellectual property theft would not just embarrass him personally, it would potentially destroy his professional reputation, undermine Henderson and Associates' credibility with clients, and create financial consequences that could affect his business partners and employees. I want you to understand the potential ramifications, Victoria said during one of our planning sessions. Your husband has built his entire professional identity around expertise that you've documented as primarily your intellectual property. Exposing this pattern publicly will likely end his consulting career and could result in significant financial liability. The weight of these potential consequences was sobering,
but it also clarified my results. Marcus had made a conscious choice to build his success on my intellectual work while systematically erasing my contributions from the public narrative. He had reduced my role to domestic support while claiming exclusive credit for innovations that depended entirely on my academic expertise and research capability. More fundamentally, he had created a situation where my own intellectual achievements were invisible to everyone except him, leaving me professionally isolated and dependent on his willingness to acknowledge my contributions, which he had demonstrated no inclination to do voluntarily. Victoria helped me understand that reclaiming recognition for my work was not just about personal validation but about professional ethics and intellectual integrity. Academic and business professionals have obligations to provide honest attribution for intellectual contributions, she explained. When someone systematically violates those obligations for personal gain, they create harm that extends beyond individual relationships to the broader professional community. Parallel to my legal strategy development, I began reaching out to professional contacts who could provide independent validation of my intellectual capabilities and research contributions. This process required considerable delicacy, since I needed to re-establish professional relationships without immediately revealing the full scope of my situation with Marcus. My first contact was Dr. Sarah Chen, a professor at Portland State University, who specialized in organizational psychology and had been a contemporary during my graduate study. Sarah had followed a traditional academic career path, earning tenure and building a reputation for innovative research on workplace culture and employee engagement, areas that closely aligned with my own consulting work. I reconnected with Sarah through a carefully crafted email that mentioned my interest in returning to academic involvement after years of applied research and business consulting contact. I suggested meeting for coffee to discuss potential collaboration opportunities and catch up on developments in organizational psychology research. Sarah was warmly receptive to reconnecting and eager to hear about my work in applied consulting. When we met at a quiet cafe near the university campus, I found myself in the unfamiliar position of describing my intellectual achievements using my own voice, rather than through Marcus's professional presentation. I've been developing frameworks for organizational culture assessment and change management, I explained, feeling simultaneously proud and nervous about claiming direct credit for my work. Most of my research has been applied in small business context, focusing on practical implementations of theoretical principles. Sarah's interest was immediately evident. That's exactly the kind of bridge between academic research and practical application that our field needs more of, she said enthusiastically. Have you published any of your consulting work? The academic community would be very interested in seeing evidence-based approaches to organizational development. The conversation continued for over 2 hours, during which I described several of my major research projects and strategic frameworks without mentioning Marcus's role in their commercial implementation. Sarah's responses confirmed Victoria's assessment that my work represented substantial intellectual achievements that deserved recognition in their own right. Claire, what you're describing sounds like a comprehensive research program that could easily support multiple academic publications, Sarah observed. The practical validation you've achieved through successful consulting implementations actually strengthens the academic value of your theoretical work. Sarah suggested that I consider presenting my research at the upcoming Pacific Northwest Conference on Applied Psychology, which featured sessions specifically focused on bridging academic theory and business practice. She offered to serve as a professional reference and help me navigate the submission process for presenting my consulting frameworks to an academic audience. Similar conversations with other professional contacts yielded comparable results. Michael Torres, who directed the organizational psychology program at University of Oregon, expressed strong interest in my research on family business succession planning. Jennifer Walsh, a consultant who had attended Marcus's presentations at industry conferences, was surprised to learn about my background and eager to discuss potential collaboration opportunities. These interactions served multiple purposes in my liberation strategy. They provided independent validation of my intellectual capabilities from respected professionals who had no knowledge of my situation with Marcus. They established potential career alternatives that would allow me to present my work under my own professional identity. Most importantly, They created a network of professional contacts who could serve as witnesses to my expertise and credibility if questions arose about my qualifications or contributions. The process of re-establishing my professional identity also required careful preparation of materials that would support my credibility during the anniversary dinner confrontation. Working with Victoria, I developed a comprehensive presentation portfolio that documented my major research projects, strategic frameworks, and successful implementations in ways that would be immediately compelling to business professionals. The portfolio included before and after case studies, showing how my interventions had improved organizational performance for Henderson and Associates clients. Each case study contained detailed documentation of the theoretical foundation, implementation methodology, and measurable outcomes that demonstrated the effectiveness of my approaches. For the Morrison Industries turnaround, I prepared materials showing how my graduate research on organizational culture had informed the strategy that increased their productivity by 40%. The documentation included academic sources that supported my approach, detailed implementation timelines, and outcome assessments that proved the success of my methodology. The Phillips merger case study demonstrated how my research on cultural integration had prevented the typical failures that plagued most corporate mergers. I documented the specific theoretical frameworks I had developed, the systematic approach I had created for assessing cultural compatibility, and the measurable improvements in employee satisfaction and operational efficiency that resulted from my strategy. The Wellington Group presentation materials showed how my advanced research on adaptive leadership had secured Henderson and Associates' largest contract. I included comprehensive documentation of the academic literature that informed my approach, the innovative frameworks I had developed for implementing organizational agility, and the specific outcomes that had impressed Wellington's board of directors. Each case study was formatted professionally and included clear attribution of intellectual sources, demonstrating the academic rigor and theoretical sophistication that distinguished my work from typical business consulting approaches. The materials provided undeniable evidence that Henderson and Associates' success depended on systematic application of my specialized expertise, rather than Marcus's intuitive business instinct. Beyond the case studies, I prepared detailed timelines showing the development of my major research projects over 15 years, with documentation of how each theoretical framework had evolved from initial academic research through practical refinement and successful implementation. These timelines provided clear evidence of intellectual development that could not be attributed to Marcus's business experience or consulting training. The most powerful component of my presentation portfolio was a comparative analysis, showing how Marcus's public presentations and published articles had systematically misrepresented the source of his consulting methodology. I created side-by-side comparisons of his professional claims with documented evidence of my actual contributions, highlighting the specific ways he had appropriated my intellectual property while claiming individual credit. These materials demonstrated not just occasional attribution oversights, but a systematic pattern of intellectual property theft that had been central to Marcus's professional success. The evidence showed that virtually every innovative methodology that distinguished Henderson and Associates from their competitors had originated from my academic research and theoretical expertise. As the anniversary dinner approached, I also needed to ensure that my evidence would be available in formats that would be immediately accessible and compelling to our guests. Working with a professional presentation designer, I created elegant summary documents that highlighted the most important evidence in visually striking formats that would be easy to understand even for audience members without academic or consulting background. The summary materials included infographics showing the timeline of my contributions to Henderson and Associates' major successes, comparison charts demonstrating the academic sources for Marcus's consulting methodology, and outcome assessments proving the effectiveness of my research-based strategies. I also prepared digital presentations that could be accessed through tablets and smartphones, allowing guests to review detailed evidence at their own pace during the dinner. These presentations included audio recordings of Marcus acknowledging my contributions and private conversations, email communications showing my research and strategy development work, and documentation of the systematic pattern of intellectual property appropriation over 15 years. The technological component of my evidence presentation required careful coordination to ensure that information would be delivered simultaneously to all dinner guests without giving Marcus an opportunity to interrupt or control the narrative. I arranged for automated delivery systems that would send summary materials to guests' phones and email addresses at predetermined times during the dinner, creating a comprehensive information campaign that would be impossible to suppress or minimize. The psychological preparation for the anniversary dinner was perhaps the most challenging aspect of my liberation strategy. For 15 years I had maintained a carefully crafted persona as the supportive, deferential wife who prioritized Marcus's professional success above her own recognition or advancement. Abandoning this role would require not just intellectual preparation, but emotional readiness to confront the man who had systematically erased my contributions from his professional narrative. Victoria helped me understand that the anniversary dinner confrontation was not primarily about personal relationship dynamics, but about professional ethics and intellectual integrity. "You're not attacking your husband personally," she reminded me during our final preparation session. "You're exposing professional misconduct and reclaiming recognition for your own intellectual achievements." This reframing was crucial for maintaining my resolve as the dinner approached. The evidence I had gathered was not about revenge or personal grievances, it was about honest accountability for intellectual contributions and professional ethics violations that had been ongoing for 15 years. The night before the anniversary dinner, I reviewed all of my materials one final time, ensuring that every component of my liberation strategy was properly coordinated and ready for implementation. The legal documentation was filed and ready for activation, the professional contacts were prepared to provide independent validation of my expertise, and the evidence presentation was configured for maximum impact and accessibility. Sitting in my home office, surrounded by 15 years of documented intellectual achievements, I felt a mixture of anticipation and profound sadness about what the next evening would bring. The anniversary dinner would mark the end of my invisible partnership with Marcus, but it would also mark the beginning of my emergence as an independent professional with recognized expertise and established credibility. For the first time in 15 years, I would present my intellectual work under my own name, claim direct credit for my research and strategic innovations, and force an honest reckoning with the true foundation of Henderson and Associates consulting success. The supportive and visible wife who had enabled Marcus's appropriation of her intellectual property was about to disappear forever, replaced by a confident professional who demanded recognition for her own achievement.
The anniversary dinner would be Marcus's celebration of what he believed was his individual success, but it would actually become my declaration of independence as an intellectual professional, whose contributions could no longer be ignored, minimized, or appropriated without consequences. The morning of our anniversary dinner dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through the windows of our West Hills home. Marcus had already left for his office, mentioning something about finalizing details for a major presentation to potential investors who would be attending the evening's celebration. His excitement was palpable. This dinner represented not just our anniversary, but what he clearly viewed as a triumph of his individual professional achievement. I spent the morning in methodical preparation, reviewing my evidence folders one final time and ensuring that every component of my strategy was properly organized and accessible. The manila envelope containing the initial financial documentation sat prominently on my dresser, but it represented only the opening salvo of what would be a comprehensive revelation spanning 15 years of systematic intellectual property appropriation. My phone contained the automated delivery system that would send detailed evidence packets to every guest's email address and smartphone at precisely timed intervals throughout the dinner. The packets included audio recordings, document comparisons, case study analyses, and professional testimonials that would paint an undeniable picture of my contributions to Henderson and Associates' success. Victoria Reed was positioned in her office, ready to provide immediate legal support if the evening's revelations created complications requiring professional intervention. We had agreed on specific communication protocols that would allow me to signal if Marcus's response became threatening or if legal protections needed to be activated immediately. Sarah Chen and my other academic contacts were aware that I would be making a significant professional announcement that evening. though I had not revealed the specific details of my situation with Marcus. They were prepared to provide independent validation of my expertise and research credentials if questions arose about my qualifications or professional capabilities. The afternoon passed slowly as I prepared for what would be the most significant evening of my adult life. I chose my outfit carefully, a sophisticated black dress that projected confidence and professionalism rather than the demure, supportive image I had cultivated for so many years. The transformation was subtle but meaningful, representing my emergence from Marcus's shadow into my own professional identity. As evening approached, I made my final preparations at home before departing for the Riverside Grille. The evidence materials were distributed among multiple secure locations to ensure they could not be compromised or suppressed regardless of how the evening unfolded. Copies were stored with Victoria, uploaded to secure cloud services, and prepared for immediate distribution to relevant professional organizations and academic institutions. The drive to the restaurant was surreal, knowing that I was traveling toward a confrontation that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of both my life and Marcus's career. For 15 years I had suppressed my own professional ambitions to support his success, accepting invisibility in exchange for what I believed was partnership. Tonight, that invisibility would end permanently. The Riverside Grille's valet parking area was already busy with arriving guests when I reached the restaurant. I recognized several faces from Marcus's business network clients, partners, and industry colleagues, who had benefited from consulting strategies that originated from my research, but credited Marcus's innovative thinking. Inside the restaurant, the Cedar Room had been transformed into an elegant celebration space with soft lighting, fresh flowers, and carefully arranged seating that would ensure optimal impact for my revelation. Marcus had positioned himself and me at the center of the horseshoe-shaped table configuration, creating a natural focal point for what he anticipated would be an evening of professional accolades and personal recognition. The guests were already engaged in animated conversations about business developments, industry trends, and Henderson and Associates' impressive growth trajectory. I moved through the pre-dinner reception with practiced social grace, engaging in familiar small talk while internally preparing for the moment when these pleasant conversations would give way to uncomfortable revelations about the true source of Marcus's professional expertise. Kevin Torres approached me near the bar, offering his customary compliments about the elegant event planning and Marcus's continued business success. "You must be so proud of everything Marcus has accomplished," he said warmly. "Henderson and Associates has really become a force in the consulting world. His innovative approaches are getting attention from firms 3 times our size." "Innovation is certainly important in consulting," I replied carefully, maintaining my composed expression while thinking about the extensive documentation proving that Marcus's innovations were systematic applications of my academic research. The most successful approaches usually combine solid theoretical foundations with practical implementation strategies. Kevin nodded enthusiastically, clearly assuming that my comment reflected general support for Marcus's methodology rather than specific knowledge about its development. "Exactly. That's what sets Marcus apart. He has this intuitive understanding of organizational psychology that most consultants just don't possess. It's like he can see patterns and solutions that aren't obvious to everyone else." The irony of Kevin's observation was almost overwhelming. Marcus's intuitive understanding was actually my doctoral-level expertise in organizational psychology, refined through 15 years of research and practical application. His ability to see patterns and solutions reflected systematic study of academic literature and theoretical frameworks that I had provided through countless hours of research and analysis. "Pattern recognition is definitely valuable in consulting work," I agreed, thinking about how my academic training had taught me to identify organizational dynamics and develop evidence-based solutions that addressed root causes rather than surface symptoms. The best consultants usually have strong analytical backgrounds that help them understand complex systems. As we continued talking, I found myself listening to Kevin describe Marcus's professional capabilities in terms that actually described my intellectual contribution. Marcus's natural instincts for reading corporate cultures were applications of cultural assessment frameworks I had developed. His innovative merger strategies were implementations of integration theories I had researched extensively. His breakthrough succession planning methodologies were refinements of family business research I had conducted for specific client context. The conversation with Kevin crystallized my understanding of how completely Marcus had appropriated not just my specific ideas, but my entire professional identity within the consulting community. His colleagues genuinely believed that his expertise originated from personal experience and intuitive capabilities rather than systematic study and academic research conducted by someone else. Marcus made his entrance shortly after 7 o'clock, immediately becoming the center of attention as guests gathered around to offer congratulations and discuss business opportunity. He was clearly in his element, radiating confidence and charm as he held court with stories about recent client successes and future expansion plans for Henderson and Associates. Watching Marcus interact with our guests, I was struck by how naturally he inhabited the role of innovative consulting expert, describing strategies and methodologies as if he had developed them through years of personal experience and professional insight. There was no hint of self-consciousness or discomfort about claiming credit for work that originated entirely from my research and intellectual contribution. The key to successful organizational transformation, Marcus was explaining to a group of potential clients, is understanding that culture change requires systematic intervention at multiple levels simultaneously. You can't just modify policies and expect sustainable behavioral change. You need comprehensive strategies that address psychological, social, and structural factors. The explanation was essentially a summary of my graduate research on organizational change management, delivered with Marcus's characteristic confidence and presented as insight gained through his consulting experience. The audience listened attentively, clearly impressed by what they perceived as sophisticated understanding of complex organizational dynamics. As dinner service began, Marcus moved among the tables, engaging in individual conversations that reinforced his reputation as an innovative thinking leader in the consulting field. I observed these interactions with growing clarity about how thoroughly he had constructed his professional identity around intellectual property that belonged to me. When Marcus spoke about breakthrough methodologies for cultural integration, he was describing frameworks I had developed through systematic analysis of merger success factors and organizational compatibility assessment. When he discussed proprietary approaches to succession planning, he was referencing strategies I had created by combining family business research with practical implementation protocols. The most disturbing aspect of these conversations was Marcus's apparent genuine belief in his own expertise. He spoke about consulting methodologies and theoretical frameworks with conviction and enthusiasm that suggested he had internalized my intellectual contributions so completely that he no longer distinguished between his own knowledge and mine. This realization added another layer of complexity to the evening's planned revelations. Marcus was not just deliberately stealing credit for my work, he had constructed his entire professional self-concept around expertise that actually belonged to me. Exposing the true source of his consulting innovations would not just embarrass him publicly, but potentially shatter his fundamental understanding of his own capabilities and achievements. As we moved toward the formal dinner presentation, I could feel the weight of anticipation building within me. The evidence packets were ready for distribution, the legal documentation was prepared for immediate implementation, and the professional network was positioned to provide independent validation of my expertise and credentials. Marcus stood to deliver his anniversary toast just as the main course was being served, positioning himself at the center of attention with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to public recognition. The room quieted expectantly as he raised his champagne glass, preparing to deliver what everyone assumed would be a heartfelt tribute to our marriage and partnership. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the elegant dining room, "tonight we celebrate not just 15 years of marriage, but 15 years of building something extraordinary together." The initial response was warm and appreciative, with several guests raising their own glasses in anticipation of a touching personal reflection. But as Marcus continued speaking, his tone shifted toward the condescending dismissal that had become his standard way of describing my role in his success. "When I married Claire, I knew I was getting someone special, a woman with the wisdom to recognize that sometimes the greatest contribution you can make is stepping back and allowing greatness to flourish. The room's energy began to shift as guests sensed the uncomfortable undertone in Marcus's work. Even his most loyal business associates looked uncertain about the direction his speech was taking, clearly recognizing that something was amiss in what should have been a celebration of marital partnership. Some people might say that Claire sacrificed her own ambitions for our success, Marcus continued, his smile becoming increasingly patronizing. But I prefer to think of it as intelligent resource allocation. Why waste talent on redundant efforts when that same talent can be channeled into supporting something truly significant? The silence that followed this statement was heavy with discomfort. Several guests shifted in their seats, clearly struggling with the obvious insult disguised as a compliment. My sister Nina's face had flushed with anger, while Marcus's own parents looked away in embarrassment at their son's public display of disrespect. But Marcus, emboldened by what he apparently perceived as successful humor, pressed forward with his character assassination disguised as an anniversary tribute. "So here's to my beautiful wife," he concluded, raising his glass with theatrical flourish, who learned early that supporting a visionary means stepping back from her own modest academic pursuits. 15 years of Deadweight, and somehow I've managed to carry us both to success. The scattered applause that followed was weak and uncomfortable, with most guests offering only token acknowledgement of what had clearly been an inappropriate and hurtful speech. But Marcus seemed oblivious to the negative reaction, settling back into his chair with obvious satisfaction at what he considered a clever and entertaining presentation. That was the moment I had been waiting for, the public humiliation that would justify everything that followed. I stood slowly, my movement immediately drawing attention from every guest in the room. The manila envelope in my hand was clearly visible, as I positioned myself to address the assembled crowd, my voice carrying a confidence and authority that few of them had ever heard from me before. "Thank you for that illuminating perspective on our marriage, Marcus," I said, my tone maintaining perfect composure despite the magnitude of what I was about to reveal. "Since we're being so candid about contributions and achievements tonight, I thought this might be the perfect opportunity to share some information that our guests might find interesting." I slid the envelope across the table toward Marcus, who glanced at it with curious amusement rather than concern. "Anniversary gift?" he asked, his tone still carrying the condescending edge from his toast. "How thoughtful. Should I open it now, or save it for private viewing later?" "Oh, I think now would be perfect," I replied, maintaining eye contact with him as he opened the envelope, especially since it concerns several people in this room who have benefited from consulting strategies that they might be interested to learn more about. Marcus's expression began to change as he pulled out the first document, a comprehensive analysis showing the academic sources and theoretical foundations for every major consulting methodology that had built Henderson and Associates' reputation. The financial documentation showed exactly how his business success correlated with systematic application of my research, but more importantly, it provided undeniable proof of intellectual property theft spanning 15 years. "What is that?" Marcus asked, his voice beginning to lose its commanding confidence as he scanned the professionally formatted evidence. "That's documentation proving that every major breakthrough in Henderson and Associates development came from research I conducted, frameworks I developed, and theoretical expertise that I provided," I answered calmly, addressing not just Marcus but the entire room. "The Morrison Industries turnaround that launched your reputation, based on my graduate research in organizational culture assessment, the Phillips merger strategy that made you famous, developed from my thesis work on cultural integration theory, the Wellington Group contract that established your firm as a major player, built on adaptive leadership frameworks that I spent months researching and developing." The room had fallen into complete silence as guests began to understand the implications of what I was revealing. Marcus's business partners were leaning forward, trying to see the documents that were clearly causing him distress, while other guests reached reflexively for their phones as notification chimes began sounding throughout the room. "The evidence packets being delivered to your phones right now contain detailed documentation of intellectual property appropriations spanning 15 years. I continued,
my voice remaining steady as chaos began to unfold around me. Audio recordings of Marcus acknowledging my contributions in private while claiming individual credit publicly, email communications showing my research and strategy development work, comparative analyses proving that virtually every consulting methodology that distinguishes Henderson and Associates originated from my academic expertise. Marcus stood abruptly, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and growing panic as he realized the scope of what was being revealed. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Claire doesn't understand the complexity of business consulting. These are just academic theories that I adapted for practical application." "Actually," I replied, removing additional materials from my briefcase, "the documentation shows exactly the opposite. You've systematically presented my practical implementations of academic theory as your own innovative business insights, violating professional ethics standards and intellectual property laws in the process." Kevin Torres had pulled out his phone and was scrolling through the evidence packet with growing alarm. "Marcus," he said, his voice tight with concern, "these recordings show you explicitly acknowledging that Claire developed the cultural integration protocol. You told me those were your proprietary methodologies. You're taking things out of context," Marcus protested. But his usual commanding presence was rapidly deteriorating as more guests reviewed the evidence on their phones. "Marriage is a partnership. We developed these strategies together." "The documentation shows otherwise," I said, maintaining my professional demeanor as Marcus's professional world began to collapse around him. "Academic ethics require clear attribution of intellectual contributions, especially when those contributions are being presented for commercial gain. Business ethics have similar requirements about honest representation of qualifications and methodologies." Dr. Sarah Chen, who had arrived as planned during the revelations, approached our table with a tablet displaying additional verification materials. "I've reviewed Ms. Henderson's research extensively," she announced to the room, her academic credentials adding weight to her testimony. "The theoretical frameworks and practical applications she's developed represent substantial contributions to organizational psychology that deserve recognition in their own right." The impact on Marcus was immediate and devastating. His carefully constructed professional identity was being systematically dismantled in front of colleagues, clients, and family members who had believed in his individual expertise and innovative capability. "This is career sabotage," Marcus said, desperately, turning to address the room rather than continuing to face my evidence. "Claire is trying to destroy everything we've built together because she's jealous of my success." "I'm not trying to destroy anything," I replied calmly. "I'm reclaiming recognition for my own intellectual work and exposing professional misconduct that has been ongoing for 15 years. The success you're claiming as individual achievement was built on systematic appropriation of my research and expertise." The room's atmosphere had transformed completely from celebration to crisis management as guests grappled with the implications of my revelations. Business partners were reviewing their own collaborations with Marcus, wondering what other aspects of his claimed expertise might be misrepresented. Potential clients were questioning whether their consulting contracts were based on fraudulent representation of capabilities. Marcus made one final attempt to regain control of the narrative, addressing the room with desperate bravado. "Even if Claire contributed research support, I'm the one who built the client relationships, delivered the presentations, and implemented the strategy. Without my business development skills, her academic theories would have remained worthless intellectual exercises." "That's exactly the kind of dismissive attitude that created this situation," I responded, finally allowing some emotion to enter my voice. "My contributions weren't research support. They were the intellectual foundation of your entire consulting practice. And the evidence shows that you were fully aware of this while choosing to misrepresent the source of your expertise for personal and financial gain." The evening had reached its climactic moment, with 15 years of hidden contributions finally exposed to public scrutiny and professional accountability. Marcus's reputation as an innovative consulting expert was in ruins. His business relationships were compromised,
and his fundamental understanding of his own capabilities had been shattered. But for me, the evening represented liberation from invisibility and the beginning of recognition for intellectual achievements that could no longer be ignored, minimized, or appropriated without consequences. The immediate aftermath of my revelations was chaos, but it was the kind of chaos that brings clarity rather than confusion. Marcus stood frozen at the center of the room, his face pale as he watched 15 years of carefully constructed professional identity disintegrate in real time. The silence that had initially greeted my evidence presentation gave way to urgent whispered conversations as guests processed the magnitude of what they had witnessed. Kevin Torres was the first to break the uncomfortable quiet, his voice cutting through the tension with sharp professional concern. "Marcus, I need to understand exactly what this means for our current client obligations," he said, his tone devoid of the friendly collegiality that had characterized their partnership for years. "If the methodologies we've been presenting as proprietary Henderson and Associates innovations are actually Mrs. Henderson's academic research, we have serious liability issues with every contract we've signed." Marcus attempted to respond, but his usual commanding presence had completely abandoned him. "Kevin, you're overreacting," he said weakly. "These are complex collaboration issues that can't be reduced to simple ownership claims. Claire is my wife. We've worked together on everything." "The documentation suggests otherwise," interjected James Mitchell, Marcus's second business partner who had been studying the evidence packet on his phone with growing alarm. "These recordings show you explicitly taking credit for methodologies while acknowledging privately that Claire developed them. That's not collaboration, that's misrepresentation." Sarah Chen stepped forward to address the room, her academic credentials lending authoritative weight to her assessment. "I've conducted an independent review of Mrs. Henderson's research portfolio," she announced, her voice professionally neutral but clearly supportive. "The theoretical frameworks and practical applications she's developed represent significant contributions to organizational psychology that meet the highest standards for academic and professional recognition." The impact of Sarah's testimony was immediate and devastating for Marcus's remaining credibility. Here was a respected academic professional with no personal investment in our marital dynamics, providing objective validation of my intellectual capabilities and research achievement. Her presence transformed the situation from a domestic dispute into a professional ethics violation with clear expert witnesses. Marcus turned to address Sarah directly, his desperation becoming increasingly evident. "Chen, surely you understand that academic theories require practical application to have business value," he said, his voice carrying a pleading quality that I had never heard before. "Claire provided research support, but I developed the client relationships and implementation strategies that made her ideas commercially viable." Sarah's response was measured but uncompromising. "Ms. Henderson, intellectual property ownership doesn't depend on commercial implementation," she explained. "Mrs. Henderson's research represents original theoretical work with documented practical application. The fact that you successfully marketed her innovations doesn't transfer ownership of the underlying intellectual property." The professional implications of Sarah's assessment were clear to everyone in the room, particularly the business associates who were beginning to calculate their own exposure to potential ethics violations and client fraud claims. The elegant anniversary celebration had transformed into an impromptu crisis management session, as Marcus's colleagues grappled with the scope of the revelation. Patricia Daniels, Kevin's wife, approached me with a mixture of curiosity and respect that contrasted sharply with the dismissive attitude she had displayed toward me for years. "Claire, I had no idea about your academic background," she said, her tone genuinely apologetic. "Marcus always described you as being focused on domestic responsibilities rather than professional work." "That was by design," I replied, maintaining the composed professionalism that had carried me through the evening's confrontation. Marcus found it convenient to minimize my contributions to preserve his narrative about individual achievement and innovative thinking. The conversation with Patricia highlighted one of the most significant aspects of my liberation: the way that exposing Marcus's intellectual property theft had simultaneously revealed his systematic manipulation of social perceptions about my capabilities and contribution. For years, our social circle had viewed me as the supportive but intellectually limited spouse who provided domestic stability while Marcus pursued serious professional work. Now, With comprehensive evidence of my academic expertise and practical achievements, these same people were forced to confront their own complicity in maintaining false narratives about my intellectual capability. The revelation was uncomfortable for everyone who had accepted Marcus's portrayal of me as pleasant but professionally irrelevant. My sister Nina, who had been silently watching the unfolding drama with visible satisfaction, finally approached to offer her support. "I always knew something was wrong with how Marcus talked about your relationship," she said quietly. "But I never imagined it was this systematic or extensive." Nina's validation was particularly meaningful because she had witnessed our relationship dynamics from the beginning. Watching as I gradually disappeared from professional conversations and academic discussions that had once been central to my identity, her recognition that something had been fundamentally wrong with our partnership provided personal confirmation that my decision to expose Marcus's behavior was justified. As the evening progressed, the business implications of my revelations became increasingly clear. Henderson and Associates' reputation was built on consulting methodologies that were now documented as systematic appropriations of my intellectual property. Every client contract, every professional presentation, and every business development initiative had been based on misrepresentation of the source of their expertise. David Park, a potential client who had been considering a major consulting contract with Henderson and Associates, approached Marcus with obvious concern. "I need to understand how this affects our proposed engagement," he said, his tone businesslike but clearly troubled. "Our board approved the contract based on your firm's proprietary methodologies and innovative approaches. If those methodologies actually belong to Mrs. Henderson, we have serious questions about representation and credentials." Marcus's attempt to reassure David only highlighted the extent of his professional predicament. "David, these are marriage dynamics that don't affect our business capabilities," he said desperately. "Henderson and Associates has a proven track record of successful implementations, regardless of how the underlying research was developed." "But that's exactly the problem," David replied, consulting the evidence packet on his phone. "Your presentations to our board emphasized proprietary innovations and unique theoretical insights as the foundation for your premium consulting fees. If those innovations aren't actually yours, then we're paying for expertise that may not exist." The systematic collapse of Marcus's professional relationships was both fascinating and sobering to witness. Years of carefully cultivated business partnerships were disintegrating as colleagues and clients grappled with questions about fraud, misrepresentation, and professional ethics violations that extended far beyond our personal marriage dynamic. Victoria Reed arrived at the restaurant precisely as planned, her presence adding legal weight to the evening's revelation. She moved through the room with professional confidence, introducing herself to guests as my attorney and providing immediate context for the intellectual property documentation that had already been distributed. "Ms. Henderson has filed formal claims for intellectual property ownership with relevant academic and professional organizations," Victoria announced to the room, her voice carrying the authority of legal expertise. "The evidence presented tonight represents preliminary documentation for proceedings that will establish clear ownership rights and pursue appropriate remedies for professional misconduct." The legal implications of Victoria's announcement sent additional shockwaves through the assembled guests. This wasn't just a marital disagreement or professional dispute, it was the beginning of formal legal action that could result in civil liability, professional sanctions, and criminal charges related to business fraud and intellectual property theft. Marcus's face had drained of all color as he began to understand that the evening's revelations were not an isolated confrontation, but the opening phase of a comprehensive legal strategy that would systematically dismantle his professional life and personal finances. The woman he had dismissed as intellectually irrelevant had orchestrated a sophisticated campaign that left him with no viable defenses or escape strategies. "Victoria, surely we can resolve this privately," Marcus said, his voice now openly pleading. "This is a family matter that doesn't require legal intervention. Claire and I can work out appropriate recognition and compensation arrangements without involving outside authorities." Victoria's response was professionally courteous, but uncompromising. "Ms. Henderson, intellectual property theft and professional misrepresentation are not family matters," she explained, Mrs. Henderson's research represents substantial commercial value that has been systematically appropriated for personal gain. The scope and duration of this appropriation requires formal legal remedy rather than private negotiation. The finality of Victoria's assessment seemed to break something fundamental in Marcus's remaining composure. For the first time that evening, he addressed me directly with genuine vulnerability rather than condescending dismissal. "Claire, you're destroying everything we built together," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. 15 years of marriage, everything we worked for, it's all going to be gone." "No, Marcus," I replied, my own voice carrying emotion for the first time that evening. "You destroyed our partnership when you decided that my contributions were invisible, that my expertise was yours to claim, and that my intelligence was something to be hidden rather than celebrated. I'm not destroying what we built. I'm finally revealing who actually built." The exchange captured the fundamental tragedy of our situation in ways that transcended the immediate professional and legal consequences. Marcus had been so committed to his narrative of individual achievement that he had systematically erased the intellectual partnership that had actually created his success, leaving us both trapped in roles that denied the reality of our collaborative relationship. But while Marcus was discovering the cost of his professional misconduct, I was experiencing the profound liberation of finally being recognized for my actual capabilities and achievements. The academic credentials that had been dismissed as irrelevant hobbies were now being acknowledged as substantial professional expertise. The research contributions that had been minimized as domestic support were being recognized as intellectual property worthy of legal protection. The transformation was both exhilarating and emotionally overwhelming. For 15 years I had accepted invisibility as the price of supporting Marcus's ambitions, gradually internalizing his assessment of my contributions as secondary and supportive rather than central and foundational. Tonight's revelations had not just exposed his misconduct, they had restored my own understanding of my intellectual worth and professional capability. As guests began to leave the restaurant, many approached me with comments that reflected their changing perception of my role in Henderson and Associates' success. Business associates who had barely acknowledged my presence at previous social events now engaged me in serious conversations about consulting theory and practical implementation strategy. "Claire, I'd be very interested in discussing your research on organizational culture assessment," said Jennifer Walsh, a consultant who had attended several of Marcus's professional presentations. "Some of the frameworks you've developed could be valuable for projects I'm working on with technology startups." The irony of Jennifer's interest was not lost on me. She was essentially asking to collaborate on research that she had previously credited to Marcus's innovative thinking. But her recognition of my expertise as worthy of independent professional consideration represented exactly the kind of acknowledgement I had been seeking for 15 years. Similar conversations occurred throughout the evening, as guests grappled with the implications of learning that the consulting innovations they had admired actually originated from someone they had consistently overlooked and underestimated. The cognitive dissonance was clearly uncomfortable for many of them, forcing recognition of their own participation in maintaining false narratives about intellectual contributions and professional capability. The evening concluded with Marcus standing alone near the restaurant's entrance, his business associates having departed with urgent conversations about damage control and liability management. The man who had arrived confident in his professional achievements and social status was now isolated and facing the comprehensive collapse of the identity he had constructed around appropriated intellectual property. As I prepared to leave the restaurant, Marcus made one final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of the evening. "Claire, we can fix this," he said desperately. "I'll acknowledge your contributions publicly, give you proper credit for the research, whatever you want. We don't have to destroy everything over attribution issues." "This was never about attribution, Marcus," I replied, feeling a profound sadness about the waste of what could have been a genuine partnership. "This was about respect, recognition, and honest acknowledgement of intellectual contributions. You had 15 years to provide that voluntarily, and instead, you chose to systematically erase my professional identity while building your success on my work." The conversation represented our final exchange as partners in any sense of the word. Marcus's offer of belated recognition revealed his continued failure to understand that the issue was not just about credit,
but about the fundamental dishonesty that had characterized our relationship and his professional practice. Walking out of the Riverside Grille that night, I felt the profound liberation of finally being seen and recognized for my actual capabilities and contribution. The supportive invisible wife, who had enabled Marcus's appropriation of her intellectual property, was gone forever, replaced by a confident professional ready to claim recognition for her own achievement. The months following the anniversary dinner brought systematic vindication of my decision to expose Marcus's professional misconduct. Henderson and Associates lost several major clients as news of the intellectual property scandal spread through the consulting community. Professional organizations launched ethics investigations that resulted in sanctions and certification suspensions. Academic institutions began recognizing my research contributions through speaking invitations and publication opportunities. Most importantly, I began presenting my work under my own name at industry conferences and academic symposiums, finally receiving direct recognition for theoretical frameworks and practical innovations that had been hidden behind Marcus's professional identity for 15 years. The positive response from colleagues and clients confirmed that my intellectual contributions had substantial value independent of Marcus's marketing abilities and business relationships. Today I maintain an independent consulting practice that builds on the research foundations I developed during my years of invisible partnership with Marcus. My client base includes several organizations that previously worked with Henderson and Associates, but now value having direct access to the source of the innovative methodologies they had originally contracted. The academic community has welcomed my return with opportunities to publish research and collaborate on projects that bridge theoretical psychology with practical business application. My work is cited in professional journals and referenced in business schools as examples of how sophisticated organizational theory can be successfully implemented in consulting context. Most significantly, I've established mentoring relationships with other women who have found themselves in similar situations of professional invisibility and intellectual appropriation. The lessons I learned about documentation, strategic planning, and professional networking have helped others reclaim recognition for their own contributions, while avoiding the trap of sacrificing intellectual identity for relationship stability. Marcus's story took a different trajectory. The legal proceedings resulted in significant financial liability and professional sanctions that effectively ended his consulting career. He relocated to another state and eventually found work in corporate training roles that didn't require the innovative expertise he had claimed as his own professional identity. The collapse of Henderson and Associates provided a cautionary tale within the consulting community about the importance of honest attribution and professional ethics in collaborative work environments. The case is now studied in business ethics courses as an example of how intellectual property theft can destroy both professional relationships and business enterprise. Reflecting on the 15 years I spent supporting Marcus's appropriation of my intellectual work, I recognize both the personal cost of my choices and the professional vindication that ultimately emerged from systematic documentation and strategic action. The experience taught me that invisible contributions remain invisible until someone has the courage to make them visible, regardless of the personal and professional costs involved. The anniversary dinner that was meant to celebrate Marcus's individual achievements instead became the moment when I finally stopped carrying his load and started claiming recognition for carrying my own. The deadweight he thought he had been managing for 15 years turned out to be the intellectual foundation that had supported his entire professional existence. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.